October 202 BC. Two armies face each other on the plains of North Africa. One is led by the greatest military genius the ancient world has ever known. The other, by a young Roman general who has studied his every move, learned from his every victory, and now stands ready to turn the master's own tactics against him. This is not just a battle. This is 16 years of war crystallized into one final desperate clash. This is the moment that will decide the fate of the Mediterranean world. This is Zama. For nearly 2 decades, Hannibal Barca had been Rome's nightmare. The Carthaginian general who swore as a child to be Rome's eternal enemy. The man who crossed the Alps with war elephants and shattered Roman legions at Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and in the killing fields of Cannae, where 50,000 Romans died in a single day. Rome had never faced anyone like him. They sent army after army, and Hannibal destroyed them all. Consuls, legions, the flower of Roman nobility, all ground into the Italian dust by a foreign invader who seemed unstoppable, unbeatable, invincible. But empires don't fall easily, and Rome had one thing Carthage could never match: an inexhaustible supply of men willing to die for the Republic. For every legion Hannibal destroyed, Rome raised 2 more. For every consul who fell, another stepped forward. And among them was a young man named Publius Cornelius Scipio, who watched Hannibal's tactical genius with the intensity of a student studying a master. But Scipio wasn't just learning to survive Hannibal, he was learning to defeat him. The seeds of Zama were planted years before, in the smoking ruins of Roman defeats. After Cannae, in 216 BC, Rome was on its knees. Hannibal's double envelopment had been a masterpiece of military art, a tactical perfection that military academies would study for thousands of years. He had used Rome's own aggression against them, drawing the Roman center forward, while his cavalry swept around the flanks, crushing the legions in a vise of bronze and blood. It was supposed to be the end. Hannibal expected Rome to surrender. Any rational state would have sued for peace, but Rome was not rational. Rome was eternal, or so its citizens believed. The Senate refused Hannibal's terms. They wouldn't even ransom back their own soldiers captured at Cannae, condemning thousands of Roman prisoners to slavery rather than show weakness. Instead, they changed their strategy entirely. If they couldn't beat Hannibal in Italy, they would strike at his supply lines, at his allies, at the very heart of Carthaginian power. They would take the war to Africa. This was not a popular strategy. Taking the fight to Carthage meant crossing the Mediterranean, landing on hostile shores, and fighting the Carthaginians on their own territory, with all their African allies at their backs. It was dangerous, costly, and required a commander of extraordinary skill and courage. The Roman Senate looked around for someone foolish or brilliant enough to attempt it. They found Scipio. Publius Cornelius Scipio was born into war. His father and uncle had both been generals fighting Carthage in Spain. Young Scipio had saved his father's life at the Battle of Ticinus, charging into enemy lines at 17 years old to rescue the wounded consul. He had survived Cannae, one of the few Roman officers to keep his head, while 50,000 of his comrades were slaughtered. And when his father and uncle were both killed in Spain in 211 BC, Scipio did something unprecedented. At just 25 years old, he demanded command of the Spanish campaign. The Senate was skeptical. He was too young, too inexperienced, too ambitious. But Rome was running out of options and running out of generals willing to face Carthaginian armies. They gave him the command, probably expecting him to die like his father and uncle before him. Scipio had other plans. In Spain, Scipio revealed himself to be something Rome had desperately needed, a general who could think like Hannibal. While other Roman commanders threw their legions forward in traditional formations, Scipio studied, adapted, and innovated. He captured New Carthage, Carthage's main stronghold in Spain, in a daring assault that used local tides to wade through supposedly impassable waters. He defeated Hasdrubal Barca, Hannibal's brother, at the Battle of Baecula and at Ilipa in 206 BC, Scipio did something that stunned the ancient world. He used Hannibal's own cannae tactics against a Carthaginian army, enveloping them with the same double pincer movement that had destroyed Rome's legions years before. Carthage's Spanish Empire collapsed. The silver mines that funded their war effort fell into Roman hands. Hasdrubal fled toward Italy to reinforce his brother, only to be intercepted and killed at the Metaurus River, his severed head thrown into Hannibal's camp as a grim message from Rome. Hannibal was alone in Italy, cut off from reinforcements, watching his alliance with Italian cities crumble as Rome slowly, methodically reclaimed the peninsula. The hunter was becoming the hunted. Scipio returned to Rome a hero, and immediately proposed the unthinkable: invade Africa. Force Carthage to recall Hannibal to defend their homeland. The Senate was divided. The conservative faction, led by Fabius Maximus, the elderly general who had pioneered the delaying tactics that kept Rome alive during the darkest years, opposed the plan. It was too risky, too expensive, too much like the hubris that had gotten Rome into this mess in the first place. Why gamble everything on an invasion when they could continue wearing Hannibal down in Italy? But Scipio had public opinion on his side. The Roman people were tired of having an enemy army camped on their soil. They wanted revenge, they wanted victory, and they wanted it in Carthage's backyard. In 205 BC, Scipio was elected consul and given permission to invade Africa, though with the caveat that he could only take volunteers and whatever resources Sicily could provide. The Senate was giving him just enough rope to either hang himself or pull off a miracle. Scipio spent the next 2 years preparing. He trained his legions relentlessly in Sicily, drilling them in new formations, new tactics, and the flexible combat style that would be needed to face Carthaginian forces and their Numidian cavalry allies. He understood that Rome's traditional strength, the heavy infantry legion, was vulnerable to the fast-moving cavalry and mobile warfare that Carthaginians excelled at. So he recruited and trained his own cavalry, negotiated alliances with Numidian princes who were rivals to Carthage, and built a fleet capable of transporting an invasion force across the sea. In 204 BC, Scipio landed in Africa with approximately 30,000 men. It was a gamble of staggering proportions. He was outnumbered, far from home, with no guarantee of resupply if things went wrong. But Scipio had calculated correctly. His arrival threw Carthage into chaos. They had grown comfortable with the war being fought in distant Italy. Now Roman legions were marching through African farmland, and the Carthaginian Senate suddenly realized their greatest general was 500 miles away when they needed him most. Carthage scrambled to assemble an army. They recalled troops from garrisons, hired mercenaries, and forged an alliance with Syphax, the powerful king of Numidia, whose cavalry had terrorized Roman forces for years. Together, they outnumbered Scipio significantly and moved to crush the Roman invasion before it could gain momentum. The two sides met in a series of engagements, where Scipio proved his tactical brilliance again and again. At the battles of Utica and the Great Plains, Scipio systematically dismantled Carthaginian armies. He used deception, surprise night attacks, and superior discipline to overcome numerical disadvantages. In one famous episode, he negotiated a peace treaty with Carthage, while simultaneously planning a devastating night raid on their allied camps, burning them to the ground and scattering their forces in chaos. It was ruthless, arguably treacherous, and devastatingly effective. The Carthaginian field armies were shattered. Panic gripped Carthage. Their Italian war, once so promising, had become an expensive stalemate. Hannibal was isolated, unable to strike a killing blow, and now Scipio was at their doorstep threatening their very existence. The Carthaginian Senate, desperate and divided, did the only thing they could. They sent word across the Mediterranean to their greatest son, "Come home, Hannibal, save us one more time." For Hannibal, the summons must have felt like a dagger to the heart. He had spent 16 years in Italy, won countless battles, outwitted dozens of Roman generals, and yet never quite delivered the knockout blow that would force Rome to surrender. He had been so close. After Cannae, if just a few more Italian allies had defected, if Carthage had sent more reinforcements, if fortune had smiled just a little more favorably, Rome would have fallen. But Rome had endured, adapted, and now his homeland was burning while he stood in Italy with an army that grew smaller every year. In 203 BC, Hannibal boarded ships and returned to Africa for the first time in decades. He brought with him approximately 15,000 veterans, hard-bitten soldiers who had marched with him across the Alps, fought in 100 battles, and remained loyal through years of hardship. These men were among the finest warriors in the ancient world, but they were few and they were tired. Hannibal would need to merge them with fresh African levies and whatever forces Carthage could scrape together. It would not be the army he deserved, but it would have to be enough. Scipio, meanwhile, had been reinforced and had secured a crucial alliance with Massinissa, a Numidian prince, whose cavalry matched the quality of Syphax's forces. This was vital. In previous battles, Roman infantry had proven they could hold their own against Carthaginian foot soldiers, but the swift Numidian horsemen had consistently terrorized Roman flanks and rear. With Massinissa's riders, Scipio would have cavalry parity, maybe even cavalry superiority. The playing field was evening. The two generals began a careful dance. Neither wanted to fight on disadvantageous terrain. Neither could afford a defeat. Scipio had Rome watching, the Senate waiting for any excuse to recall him if he failed. Hannibal had Carthage's survival resting on his shoulders, and he knew better than anyone that one lost battle could end empires. They exchanged embassies, probed each other's positions, and, according to ancient historians, even met face-to-face for negotiations. The meeting between Scipio and Hannibal, if it truly happened, must rank among the most dramatic encounters in military history. Here was the student facing the master, the hunter meeting the hunted, two brilliant minds who had defined an entire generation of warfare standing together on the eve of their final confrontation. Ancient sources claim Hannibal offered generous peace terms. Carthage would abandon all claims in Italy and Spain, pay reparations, and recognize Roman supremacy in the Western Mediterranean. It was a reasonable offer from a general who knew the odds, who understood that Carthage was exhausted and Rome was ascendant. But Scipio refused. He had not crossed the sea and spent 2 years fighting in Africa to accept the same terms Carthage could have accepted after Cannae. Rome wanted total victory now, unconditional surrender, and the permanent elimination of Carthage as a military threat. The negotiations collapsed. Both men returned to their armies knowing that words had failed. Only battle would decide this. The armies converged near a town called Zama, about 5 days' march southwest of Carthage itself. The exact location is still debated by archaeologists, but what happened there is crystal clear in the historical record. Hannibal arrived first and chose his ground carefully. He positioned his forces on relatively flat terrain, with no obvious geographical advantages to either side. This was to be a pure test of tactical skill and military might, exactly the kind of battle Hannibal had won dozens of times before. Hannibal's army numbered somewhere between 40 and 50,000 men, though these numbers are disputed and ancient sources are notoriously unreliable about army sizes. What we know for certain is that his force was divided into 3 distinct lines, an unusual formation for Hannibal, but one that made sense given his circumstances. His first line consisted of mercenaries and hastily recruited North African infantry, perhaps 12,000 strong. These were expendable troops, meant to blunt the Roman advance and tire out the legionaries before they reached Hannibal's better forces. The second line contained approximately the same number of Carthaginian citizen soldiers and Libyan infantry, better trained and equipped than the first line, but still not elite troops. And behind them, held in reserve, stood Hannibal's true weapon, his Italian veterans. 15,000 men who had fought at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae. Men who had crossed the Alps and survived everything Rome had thrown at them for 16 years. These soldiers would not break. They would die where they stood if Hannibal asked it of them. On his flanks, Hannibal placed his cavalry, perhaps 4,000 horsemen total, a mix of Carthaginian and Numidian riders. And in front of his entire army, in a dramatic opening gambit, Hannibal positioned 80 war elephants. These massive beasts, trained for combat and capable of trampling infantry formations, were meant to terrify the Romans, disrupt their neat lines, and create chaos that Hannibal's cavalry could exploit. It was psychological warfare as much as military tactics. Elephants had broken Roman armies before. Perhaps they would do so again. Scipio surveyed the Carthaginian deployment from his position and recognized immediately what Hannibal was attempting. The elephants would charge first, trying to shatter Roman cohesion. Then the cavalry would strike the flanks, while the 3 infantry lines ground down the legions through sheer attrition. It was sound strategy from a general working with limited resources. But Scipio had studied Hannibal too long to be surprised by anything. Scipio's army was smaller, perhaps 35,000 men, but it was better organized and commanded by officers who had fought together for years. He arranged his legions in the traditional 3-line Roman formation, hastati in front, young soldiers eager to prove themselves, principes in the second line, experienced warriors in their prime, and triari in the rear, grizzled veterans who were the last line of defense. But Scipio made 2 crucial modifications that would prove decisive. First, instead of arranging his maniples in the usual checkerboard pattern, where gaps in the front line were covered by troops in the second line, Scipio aligned them in straight columns with clear lanes running from front to back through his entire formation. These corridors were wide enough for elephants to pass through. When Hannibal's elephants charged, Scipio's troops could simply open the lanes, guide the beasts through with trumpet calls and shouting, and let them run harmlessly to the rear without ever engaging the main infantry lines. It was brilliant, simple, and completely nullified Hannibal's opening gambit. Second, Scipio placed his cavalry on both flanks under the command of his most trusted officers, Roman cavalry under Lelius on the left, and Massinisa's superior Numidian horsemen on the right. Scipio gave them explicit orders: engage Hannibal's cavalry, drive them from the field entirely, and then return to attack the Carthaginian infantry from behind. This was asking a lot. Cavalry battles were chaotic, unpredictable affairs, where pursuit often took riders miles from the main battlefield. But if Scipio's horsemen could maintain discipline, if they could defeat their opponents and return in time, they would deliver the same kind of double envelopment that Hannibal had perfected at Cannae. The student was about to teach the master a final lesson. The morning of the battle broke clear and hot over the African plains. Ancient sources disagree on the exact date, but most place it in October of 202 BC, when the Mediterranean heat still lingered, but the worst of summer had passed. Both armies had spent the night in their camps, soldiers checking weapons, making offerings to their gods, and trying to ignore the gnawing fear that comes before battle. Some would see the sunset, many would not. Hannibal deployed first, his army stretching across the plain in its 3 distinct lines, with the elephants swaying and trumpeting in front. It must have been an imposing sight, the kind of spectacle designed to break enemy morale before the first sword was drawn. These were not the alpine elephants Hannibal had brought to Italy years before. Those magnificent beasts had long since perished. These were African forest elephants, smaller than their Indian cousins, but still terrifying to soldiers who had never faced them. 80 massive animals, tusks sharpened, towers strapped to their backs, carrying archers. Scipio watched the display and gave his orders. The Roman legions moved into position with the practiced efficiency that had made them masters of the Mediterranean. Trumpets blared, centurions barked commands, and 35,000 men arranged themselves into precise formations. The corridors Scipio had planned were clearly visible now, straight lanes running through the entire Roman line. Hannibal, observing from his command position, must have noticed this unusual deployment. Did he understand what Scipio was planning? Did he realize his elephant charge was already countered? We'll never know what thoughts passed through the Carthaginian general's mind in those final moments before the battle began. The distance between the two armies closed. 100 yards, 50. Close enough now to see individual faces, to recognize the fear or determination in enemy eyes. Hannibal gave the signal. The elephant handlers, called mahouts, urged their charges forward. 80 war elephants began to move, slowly at first, then building to a thunderous charge that shook the earth. This was the moment that had broken armies before. The psychological shock of several tons of enraged animal bearing down on you, with nothing but a wooden shield and a short sword for protection. But Scipio was ready. At his signal, the Roman trumpets and horns began to sound. Not the usual military calls, but a cacophony of noise designed specifically to terrify and confuse the elephants. Roman soldiers banged their swords against their shields, creating a wall of sound. And critically, the legionaries in the corridors began to step aside, opening the lanes Scipio had prepared. Some elephants, already panicked by the noise, veered off course and ran wild through their own cavalry on the Carthaginian flanks, trampling their own men in their terror. Others charged straight into the Roman lines, but found themselves funneled into the open corridors, guided through by shouting soldiers and trumpet calls, running harmlessly to the rear, where they were eventually killed or captured by reserve troops. A few elephants did crash into the Roman formations, and where they struck they caused terrible casualties, crushing men and breaking shield walls. But they were too few and too disorganized to achieve the devastating impact Hannibal had hoped for. Within minutes, the elephant charge had failed completely. Worse, on the Carthaginian left flank, the panicked elephants had disrupted Hannibal's cavalry so badly that when Maecenas' Numidian horsemen charged, the Carthaginian cavalry broke and fled almost immediately. On the right flank, Laelius led the Roman cavalry against Hannibal's remaining horsemen and drove them from the field as well. This was the critical moment. Scipio's cavalry had won their engagements faster than anyone could have predicted. Now, they rode off in pursuit, disappearing from the battlefield entirely as they chased the broken Carthaginian horsemen across the plain. Hannibal might have allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. The elephant gambit had failed and his cavalry was gone, but he still had 40,000 infantry facing 35,000 Romans, and the Roman cavalry had just removed themselves from the equation by pursuing too aggressively. If Hannibal could destroy the Roman legions before their cavalry returned, he could still win this battle. The infantry lines crashed together with the sound of thousands of shields and swords meeting simultaneously, a noise that veterans said could be heard miles away. Hannibal's first line of mercenaries and African levies surged forward, screaming war cries in a dozen languages. These men knew they were expendable, knew they were being sacrificed to tire out the Romans, and some fought with the desperate courage of men who have nothing to lose. Others broke quickly, having no real loyalty to Carthage and no desire to die for someone else's empire. The Roman hastati, young men fighting in their first major battle, held their ground and pushed forward. They had been drilled relentlessly by Scipio's officers, taught to maintain formation no matter what, to trust the man beside them and the tactics that had conquered Spain. They threw their pila, heavy javelins designed to puncture shields and armor, and then closed with their gladii, short swords perfect for the brutal close-quarters combat of ancient warfare. The Carthaginian first line began to crumble, but Hannibal had planned for this. As his first line broke and fled, they ran not to the rear but to the sides, streaming away from the battlefield entirely. This prevented them from retreating into Hannibal's second line and disrupting that formation. It also meant the Romans had to continue advancing if they wanted to press their advantage. The hastati, blood up and sensing victory, surged forward into the gap, only to find themselves facing Hannibal's second line, fresh troops, better equipped, and not nearly as frightened. The battle reset. The Roman hastati were now tired from their first engagement, breathing hard, some wounded. Hannibal's second line was fresh and ready. They counterattacked with disciplined fury, pushing the young Romans back. Scipio, watching from his command position, recognized that his first line was in danger of breaking. He ordered the Princeps forward, his second line of more experienced warriors. The Principes moved through the gaps in the hastati formation and took over the fight, their greater experience immediately telling as they stabilized the Roman line and began pushing the Carthaginians back. Now it was Hannibal's second line that began to waver. They had expected to overwhelm tired, disorganized Romans. Instead, they faced fresh troops with superior equipment and training. The Carthaginian center started to bow inward, men dying by the hundreds as the Roman killing machine ground forward. Hannibal's second line began to break, soldiers fleeing to the rear in growing panic. And then came the moment that would define the battle. Hannibal's second line, retreating in disorder, tried to fall back into the third line where Hannibal's veterans waited. But Hannibal, in a move that shocked ancient historians, ordered his veterans to close ranks and refuse entry to the fleeing troops. He lowered the spears of his third line, creating a wall that his own retreating soldiers could not pass. It was ruthless, perhaps the coldest decision Hannibal ever made, but it was tactically sound. He would not allow panicked, broken troops to disrupt his last, best formation. The fleeing Carthaginians scattered to the sides. Some were cut down by pursuing Romans. Others fled the battlefield entirely. And suddenly, there was a pause in the fighting. A strange, terrible quiet, as both armies realized they had reached the final act. The Roman legions, now including both hastati and Principes fighting together, faced Hannibal's 15,000 veterans across a field littered with the dead and dying. Behind the Romans, the triari, the third and final line of the legions, waited in reserve. This was it. Everything that had happened the past 16 years, all the battles, all the blood, all the strategy and suffering, came down to this moment. Hannibal's veterans stood in perfect formation, shields locked, spears leveled. These men had beaten armies larger than the force they now faced. They had survived the Alps, held Italy for 16 years, and followed Hannibal through impossible campaigns. They would not break. They could not break. Everything Carthage was, everything their families and their civilization represented, stood with them on that field. The Romans advanced. There were no tricks left now, no clever tactics or brilliant maneuvers. This was going to be decided by raw courage, strength, and the willingness to die for your cause. The two lines met with a crash that must have echoed across Africa. Roman gladiae thrust between Carthaginian shields. Spears drove through Roman armor. Men pushed with their shields, trying to create space to swing a weapon or drive an enemy backward. The formations compressed. Soldiers in the rear ranks shoving forward. Men in the front ranks unable to retreat even if they wanted to. This was the kind of fight Hannibal's veterans excelled at. The grinding, brutal infantry combat where experience and skill mattered more than anything else. The Roman advance stalled. The Carthaginian line held. And incredibly, against all odds, Hannibal's third line began to push the Romans back. These veterans were doing what they had always done, turning certain defeat into possible victory through sheer martial excellence. Scipio's legions wavered. If this had been canny, if Hannibal had his cavalry, this would be the moment they returned and struck the Roman rear, completing the envelopment and turning the battle into a massacre. But Hannibal's cavalry was gone, scattered miles across the plain. And Scipio's cavalry was still out there somewhere, pursuing the broken Carthaginian horsemen. The battle hung in perfect, terrible balance. Scipio made his move. He ordered his triari forward, his last reserve, the final line of the Roman army. These were the oldest, most experienced soldiers in the legions, men who had seen decades of war and were famous for their steadiness in crisis. The Romans had a saying, "It has come to the triari," meaning things had gotten so desperate that the last reserve was committed. When the triari entered battle, it meant everything was on the line. But Scipio did something unusual. Instead of just throwing the triari straight into the fight, he pulled his hastati and principes back slightly, extending his line, and then repositioned his triari on the flanks. This meant the Roman line was now longer than the Carthaginian line, threatening to wrap around Hannibal's veterans from the sides. It was a risky maneuver, pulling troops back in the middle of a desperate fight, but it worked. The Roman line extended and began to curve around the Carthaginian flanks. Hannibal's veterans recognized the danger. They were being enveloped. The same tactic Hannibal had used to destroy the Romans at Cannae. But without cavalry to complete the encirclement, and with limited numbers, they couldn't stop it. They fought with the courage of doomed men, selling their lives as expensively as possible. But they were being surrounded, pressed from the front and the sides, dying in their ranks with nowhere to retreat. And then, at the critical moment, the sound of thunder rolled across the battlefield. Not the thunder of a storm, but the thunder of thousands of hooves. Laelius and Massinissa had returned. The Roman and Numidian cavalry had chased the Carthaginian horsemen for miles, defeated them completely, and then, showing the discipline that made Roman armies so effective, they had turned back. They had returned to the battlefield at the exact moment when they could deliver the killing blow. The cavalry smashed into the rear of Hannibal's veterans. Now the Carthaginians were truly surrounded, attacked from all sides by Roman infantry from the front, and flanks and Roman cavalry from the rear. This was Cannae in reverse, the student using the master's own tactics to destroy him. Hannibal's veterans fought on because they had no choice, because surrender was not in their nature, because they were warriors to the core. But there is no tactic, no amount of skill or courage that can save you when you're completely surrounded by a larger force. The Carthaginian third line was annihilated, not defeated or routed, but destroyed almost to the last man. Ancient sources claim 20,000 Carthaginians died on that field, most of them in that final terrible slaughter. The killing continued until exhaustion and the sheer number of bodies made it impossible to continue. When the sun began to set, the plains of Zama were carpeted with the dead. Hannibal survived. In the chaos of the final collapse, he fought his way clear with a small group of cavalry that had rallied to him. He rode for Carthage, beaten for the first time in his career, his army destroyed, his veterans dead. The man who had terrorized Rome for 16 years had finally met his match. Scipio had done what no Roman general before him could do. He had defeated Hannibal Barca in open battle. The casualty figures from ancient sources are staggering, but must be treated with some skepticism, as ancient historians often exaggerated numbers. Polybius, our most reliable source, claims the Carthaginians lost 20,000 killed and another 20,000 captured, while Roman losses were perhaps 1,500 to 2,000. Even if these numbers are inflated, the scale of the Carthaginian defeat is clear. It was total, catastrophic, and irreversible. Scipio did not march on Carthage immediately. He had won the battle, but sieging a major city with a battered army far from home was another matter entirely. Instead, he offered terms, harsh terms, but not annihilation. Carthage would give up all territories outside Africa. They would hand over their fleet, keeping only 10 ships. They would pay an enormous indemnity of 10,000 talents over 50 years. They would never make war without Roman permission. They would recognize Rome as the supreme power in the Mediterranean. Carthage, with Hannibal's shattered army the only thing standing between them and complete destruction, accepted. The Second Punic War was over. Rome had won, but at a cost that had nearly destroyed them. The war had lasted 17 years, killed hundreds of thousands, devastated the Italian countryside, and pushed Rome to the very brink of collapse. But they had endured, and now they stood as the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. Hannibal lived for nearly 20 more years, serving Carthage in various capacities, always under Roman scrutiny. He tried to rebuild Carthaginian power through economic reforms and political maneuvering, but Rome would never let him rest. Eventually, when Rome demanded his extradition, Hannibal fled east, offering his services to various kings who opposed Rome. He never returned to North Africa. In 183 BC, surrounded by Roman agents in Bithynia with no escape possible, Hannibal took poison rather than be captured. His last words were reported to be, "Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." Scipio returned to Rome as the greatest hero of his generation. He was granted the honorific name Africanus for his victory in Africa, something unprecedented for a Roman general. He served as consul again, defended his reputation against political enemies who were jealous of his success, and eventually retired to his country estate. He died in 183 BC, the same year as Hannibal, as if fate had tied these two great opponents together, even to the end. His tomb bore the inscription, "Ungrateful fatherland, you shall not even have my bones," a bitter comment on how Rome had turned on him in his later years despite all he had done for the Republic. The Battle of Zama changed the course of Western civilization. If Hannibal had won, if Carthage had survived as a major power, the entire trajectory of European history would have been different. There would have been no Roman Empire as we know it, no spread of Latin language and law, no foundation for medieval Europe. The battle decided not just which city would control the Mediterranean, but which culture, which language, which ideas would shape the future of the Western world. For Rome, Zama was validation of everything they believed about themselves, their discipline, their refusal to surrender, their ability to learn from defeat and come back stronger. It set them on the path to empire, teaching them that they could defeat anyone, conquer anywhere, and that temporary defeats were just opportunities to learn and improve. Within 50 years of Zama, Rome would control the entire Mediterranean, crushing Macedon, conquering Greece, destroying what remained of Carthage, and establishing an empire that would last for centuries. For Carthage, Zama was the beginning of the end. Though they survived as a city and even prospered economically under the Roman peace, they never recovered their military power. Rome never fully trusted them, never forgot the terror of Hannibal's invasion. 50 years after Zama, Cato the Elder would end every speech in the Roman Senate with the phrase "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed. And in 146 BC, Rome finally did just that, burning Carthage to the ground in the Third Punic War, and allegedly sowing the ruins with salt so nothing would ever grow there again. The battle itself became a case study in military tactics. Scipio's victory demonstrated that even the most brilliant tactical genius could be defeated if you studied him carefully enough, learned from his methods, and had the discipline to execute complex maneuvers under the stress of battle. Military academies from Rome to the present day have studied Zama as an example of how to defeat a superior enemy through preparation, tactical flexibility, and the ability to adapt during combat. What made Scipio's victory particularly remarkable was how he used Hannibal's own methods against him. The double envelopment, the use of cavalry to strike the rear, the careful management of reserves, all of these were Hannibal's techniques refined and perfected. Scipio proved that genius can be studied, learned, and ultimately surpassed. He was the first Roman general to truly understand that winning wasn't about Roman virtues alone, but about adapting to your enemy, using their strengths against them, and never being too proud to learn from your defeats. The personal rivalry between Scipio and Hannibal has fascinated historians for over 2,000 years. They met only once in battle, but that single encounter determined the fate of civilizations. Hannibal, the older warrior, the brilliant innovator who had reinvented ancient warfare. Scipio, the young student who had learned from the master and surpassed him. There's a legend, probably apocryphal, that years after Zama, Scipio and Hannibal met again at the court of an eastern king. Scipio supposedly asked Hannibal who he thought were the greatest generals in history. Hannibal named Alexander, Pyrrhus, and then himself. Scipio, amused, asked where Hannibal would rank if he had won at Zama. Hannibal replied, "Then I would place myself before Alexander." It was a gracious acknowledgement that Scipio had achieved something no other general had done: defeat Hannibal in his prime. The battlefield of Zama itself has never been definitively located. Archaeologists and historians have proposed several sites in modern Tunisia, but conclusive evidence remains elusive. Perhaps it's fitting that the location of this pivotal battle remains mysterious, buried somewhere beneath the African soil, along with the bones of 20,000 Carthaginian soldiers who died there. What isn't mysterious is the impact of what happened on that October day in 202 BC. Two armies met, one led by history's greatest tactical genius, the other by a Roman general who had done his homework. When the day ended, Rome stood supreme, and the course of Western civilization was set for the next 2,000 years. Zama was more than a battle. It was the culmination of one of history's greatest military contests, a personal duel between two brilliant minds, and a turning point that decided whether Rome or Carthage would dominate the Mediterranean world. Scipio's revenge was complete. The student had defeated the master. Rome had survived its greatest threat, and the name Hannibal Barca, which had terrified Roman children for a generation, would pass into history as a cautionary tale about the limits of genius when facing an enemy that refuses to quit, learns from every defeat, and finally produces a champion worthy of the challenge. The lessons of Zama echo through military history, that numerical superiority means nothing without tactical skill, that past victories guarantee nothing in the next battle, that the greatest weapon is not cavalry or elephants or superior numbers, but the ability to learn, adapt, and outthink your opponent, that sometimes the student surpasses the master, and that in the end, wars are won not by those who never lose, but by those who refuse to accept that any defeat is final. On the plains of North Africa, in the year 202 BC, Publius Cornelius Scipio proved all of this. He took everything Hannibal had taught Rome through 16 years of devastating defeats, turned those lessons into victory, and ended the Second Punic War with a triumph that would be remembered as long as people study warfare. It was Scipio's revenge. It was Rome's vindication. And it was the day the world changed forever.